previous video, we explored the top 10 most indebted countries in the world in just 5 minutes. It can be seen that most of the largest public debts today come from developed countries with large economies, including the United States, China, and Japan. So if you ever wondered which country in Southeast Asia is the most indebted currently and what rank Vietnam holds in the region, all will be answered in today's video. Note that to compare the debt level of a country, we can rely on various indicators. And in today's video, we will use data from the International Monetary Fund in 2022 to rank the countries in the region. Ranking 11th in the list is Timor-Leste. This is the smallest economy in Southeast Asia, with a GDP of $4.9 billion in 2022. Their total public debt this year was only $274.4 million. It can be said that Timor-Leste is a typical example of a poor, somewhat backward country but very peaceful and especially not heavily indebted. The development philosophy for many generations of leadership in this island nation is to spend what it means. Simply put, spend what you have, absolutely avoiding the use of national credit. In 2017, the Minister of Tourism, Culture, and Arts of Timor-Leste, Mr. Francisco Cabua de Ley, caused us. We have $1, we spend $1. We also want skyscrapers, television towers, grand projects, but to borrow and go into debt, we never do. We are not envious of others, we are proud because we are ourselves. On the 15th anniversary of independence, we can hold our heads high because we owe no one, depend on no one. Perhaps living next to two major powers, Australia and Indonesia, and being occupied by the army, has made Timor-Leste's intellectuals and leaders always forge and nurture themselves. Overall, it is precisely because of such an independent stance that not many outstanding infrastructure projects have been built. Despite being so poor, this country provides free general education and healthcare for its people. People aged 60 and above receive a subsidy of $60 per month, while the unemployment allowance. Especially, students who complete high school can use 4 languages: the native Pedam, Portuguese, English, and Bahasa Indonesia. This helps the future generation integrate quickly with the world. However, the cost of living here is very expensive. Currently, Timor-Leste does not have its own currency but they only mint coins and also have denominations like quarter, dime, cent, similar to US coin. Of course, they are not US coins and can only be used in this Southeast Asian country. Next is Brunei. In 2022, this Southeast Asian country had a GDP of about 16.68, while public debt was only around $350.28 million, equivalent to 2.1% of it. Brunei is one of the countries with the most prudent public debt management in the world, and the most important reason is that this small country has abundant oil revenues relative to its area and population size. That's revenue and contributes about 60% of the country. Thanks to this resource, the government budget of Brunei is quite ample without needing to borrow much. In that regard, the fiscal policy of this country's government also greatly influenced. They have implemented a careful and effective fiscal policy, including investing in strategic projects such as developing more diverse industries, tax system reforms, reducing management costs, and additionally, Brunei also focuses on investing in new economic sectors, such as information technology, financial services, and economic diversification helps this country create new revenue and reduce dependence on the oil sector, helping Brunei avoid future economic risk. The government has prioritized financial discipline and avoided excessive spending on. Moreover, the Brunei government also supports businesses through investment programs. This also reduces the risk of high government debt. At the same time, Brunei has the smallest population in Southeast Asia, so managing the budget and avoiding high public debt is easier, compared to countries with larger population. A small population also means lower spending demands for education and healthcare costs are less compared to other countries. Next is Cambodia. In recent years, Cambodia has experienced continuous leading to significant accumulation of public debt and increased strain on the budget. As of the end of 2002, the GDP of the Kingdom of Cambodia was only 28.8, but the total public debt had reached 10.03 billion, equivalent to 34.8% of this country's GDP.
The majority of this debt belongs to China. It can be seen that, besides being a close friend,
helping Cambodia in all aspects, Beijing is also Phnom Penh's largest creditor. However, it cannot be denied that the strong investment and billions of dollars in loans from China has somewhat helped Cambodia achieve its remarkable transformation. Although it is a country with a not yet fully developed economy,
Cambodia's transportation system is very developed.
Not only roads and railways, but the aviation infrastructure is also being built and expanded.
However, too much of anything is not good.
With the current dependence in many areas,
Cambodia risks becoming the country with the most debt to China.
Currently, the financial situation in Cambodia is not at. This is because Cambodia's debt to GDP ratio is below the 40% threshold. This figure is much lower than the debt to GDP ratio in many other countries. For example, the world's #1 has a debt to GDP ratio of 121 where Japan's public debt in 2022 reached 260.1%. However, this is not something to celebrate, because in reality, the borrowing situation has increased at a significant rate over the past. Nevertheless, the pagoda country is still large-scale projects with investment capital from China. In addition to the large debts from China, Cambodia is also burdened with smaller, as many of its citizens are struggling
to repay loans from microfinance companies.
Currently, over 10% of Cambodia's population owes more than they can repay.
At first glance, we see little connection.
However, government debt and citizen debt are very closely linked, because if a country cannot repay its debt, that country's government will start taxing its citizens more. However, the people do not have sufficiently good financial conditions. If this country's government,
the people cannot afford the additional costs. In 8th place is Laos.
Similar to Cambodia, Laos is currently also a country with close and receives much investment from China. And just like the pagoda country, the land of a million elephants also faced, with a 2022 GDP of $15.3 billion. Laos' public debt had reached $19.66 billion, equivalent to 128.5% of GDP.
This level is too high and dangerous,
making Laos one of the countries with the highest risk of default in Asia.
In addition, as of December 2022,
Laos' foreign exchange reserves only reached 1.1 billion. This somewhat limits the country's ability to repay its debt. Even payments for imported goods by Laos in foreign currency are facing debt. At the same time, the touring debts are increasingly approaching. It is expected that from 2021 to 2025, Laos must pay $1 to 1.3 billion
to creditors led by China.
These factors have caused the Lao Kip to depreciate sharply, losing 32.9% of its value against the Thai baht and 37.9% against the US dollar. It also reduced the country's economic size from 18 in 2021 to $15.3 billion in 2022. The depreciation of the Lao Kip
and severe labor shortages are the main causes,
leading to high inflation, making Laos one of the countries with the highest inflation rates in Southeast. This not only negatively affects the economy,
but also makes the lives of Lao people more difficult.
Due to the unstable economic situation, many international, such as the World Bank and credit rating agencies like Fitch,
have warned about Laos' foreign debt burden.
Currently, many experts believe this country will become the latest of the debt trap diplomacy policy that China is implementing. Despite economic difficulties, even after the COVID-19 pandemic, Vientiane still seeks to borrow more money from Beijing
to restructure its loans. An alarming move is that Beijing now controls Laos' power grid
and is expanding to this Southeast Asian country's water resource. In the long term, this will certainly seriously impact the environment and sustainable development of Laos, as well as many countries through which the Mekong,
including Vietnam.
However, there are also optimistic opinions that Laos will not default like Sri Lanka and won't have to surrender strategic assets, similar to how Pakistan allowed China to control water ports. Beijing, as the largest creditor but also wanting to be Vientiane's political ally,
to let Laos default because that could deeply affect the reputation of the world.
In 7th place is Myanmar. In 2022, this country's GDP was $66.16 billion, while public debt reached 39.6, equivalent to 60% of Myanmar's GDP.
This country's economy is one of the least developed in the world.
With decades of stagnation due to poor management and international, a new UN report states that nearly half of Myanmar's population could fall into poverty. As the economy stands on the brink of collapse due to two shocks, the COVID-19 pandemic, while food prices are rising, wages and incomes have significantly decreased. In addition, basic services like banking and healthcare are deteriorating. An inadequate social security system could push millions of people below the poverty line. Despite possessing great potential to become a strong development,
to this day, this country remains mired in instability.
After the Myanmar military overthrew the government of Aung San Suu Kyi in February, since then, Myanmar's economic and political activities have increasingly reached,
while people's lives have also become more difficult. This has resulted in very low government revenue over many years,
forcing them to borrow to fund government operations and social programs. Notably, despite that, Myanmar still had to increase defense budget spending. It can be said that, with the country's highly unstable situation, ongoing ethnic conflicts, the government is forced to continuously strengthen it. However, many opinions suggest that, since for most of the time from independence until now, power has always been in the hands of the Myanmar military, their heavy investment in defense is understandable. Recently, Myanmar General Min Aung Hlaing approved a military budget of over 2.7 billion for the 2023-2024 fiscal year, accounting for over 4% of the country's GDP.
This large amount is spent to ensure soldiers' livelihoods, training,
repairing defense facilities, combat training, and purchasing weapons and equipment. Additionally, part of the funding is used for road construction, ensuring readiness for military campaigns and combat training. Meanwhile, for the West, Myanmar's brand became less attractive since 2017. After the military crackdown on Rohingya Muslims in Rakhine State, leading to genocide allegations,
analysts believe that the military running the country again could be the last straw for Western businesses.
Given Myanmar's unstable situation in recent years, many experts agree that China will be the only country that Myanmar's military government wants to get closer to in the future. Since 2017, through the Belt and Road Initiative, capital flows from China have poured into Myanmar. This has raised some domestic concerns about China's influence on national sovereignty, as well as increasing debt levels. Nevertheless, with a weak economy, Myanmar needs investment capital from China for development, especially in border areas. However, to date, Beijing's construction of major infrastructure projects in Myanmar has not been very promising. For example, the $1.5 billion Liaison hydropower dam project faced strong criticism and opposition from the public,
forcing construction to halt since 2011.
More recently, the Muse-Mandalay railway line was postponed after the coup broke out and conflicts spread.
Our country's economy has achieved certain growth over many years.
According to International Monetary Fund data, Vietnam's GDP is $406.45 billion, and public debt is about $143 billion, equivalent to 35.3%. Many reports suggest Vietnam's public debt is high, but with a population of nearly 100 million people,
our country's current public debt is not too large.
Vietnam is in the early stages of development, with huge investment needs, so there's a deficit every year
to cover expenses, causing budget deficits, and when there.
Because printing money for spending is not enough. Globally, even the wealthiest countries must borrow. The issue is what the borrowing is for. Whether the borrowed money can repay both principal and interest on time, and the efficiency of capital utilization. Even with the world's wealthiest country like the US, the government management apparatus has had to shut down when Congress doesn't raise the public debt ceiling, because part of the borrowed money is used for regular spending. Vietnam is different, with a clear policy that all borrowed funds are used for development investment. Absolutely no borrowing for regular expenses, particularly costs within revenue capacity, and only borrowing within. In the coming years, like other countries worldwide, Vietnam will still need to borrow to build power grid systems, transportation networks, seaports, and important airports. Without borrowing for investment, the country cannot integrate and develop. Overall, in the context of global public debt rising at the fastest rate of the past year, effectively controlling and improving Vietnam's national credit rating is considered a bright spot in the multicolored picture of the post-COVID world economy. In recent times, public debt safety indicators have continued to be strictly controlled within the limits of ensuring national financial security and contributing to strengthening fiscal policy. Evidence shows that Vietnam's public debt in 2022 remained at sustainable. Public debt size was equivalent to 35.3% of GDP, much lower than the 60% ceiling set by the National Assembly. Additionally, in 2023, Vietnam's foreign exchange reserves are forecast to reach about $100 billion and increase to over $110 billion. This will partly help our country have more room to stabilize exchange rates in the context of upcoming inflation. If this foreign exchange reserve is lacking, then in case public debt increases without reasonable spending, it could easily lead our country into a state of default.
In fifth place is the Philippines. This is one of the most economically developed countries in the region.
And in 2012, Philippines' GDP was $404.28 billion, while public debt was about $230, equivalent to 57.5% of the country's GDP.
The Philippine economy had grown strongly since 2010.
However, in recent years there have been signs of slowdown as millions of people lost due to closure and lockdown policies to prevent the COVID-19 pandemic. Although recovering more strongly than expected with 5.6% growth and forecast to be one of the best growing economies in Southeast Asia this year, the Philippines still faces high inflation rates that deeply affect households with reduced income due to the pandemic. When the COVID-19 outbreak intensified, the government provided substantial subsidies to each individual in the informal and unemployed workforce. Thanks to benefiting from this money, many families temporarily escaped poverty. Additionally, the Philippines is located on the Pacific Ring of Fire, so it frequently suffers many devastating natural disasters, even estimating up to 20 typhoons and tropical depressions land in the Philippines each year.
Not to mention earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. That's lives and seriously affected the country.
Because it not only destroys entire infrastructure but also leaves people homeless, forcing them to rely on government support policies. Especially in Manila, which has been witnessing population explosion over many years, facing the situation of migrants flocking to the capital, overloading the transportation, healthcare, and public services, the administration of former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte implemented the return to rural areas, prioritizing the unemployed, homeless, and those living in disaster-prone areas. Accordingly, people who move out of Manila capital to rural areas or other provinces and cities will be granted about $2,000 by the government. An estimated nearly 60,000 people have registered to participate since this program started in mid-May 2020. Overall, the Philippine government has significantly increased borrowing to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19, along with the cost of living crisis that has caused Philippines' public debt to increase more strongly.
In fourth place is Malaysia.
This country had a 2022 GDP of $404.28 billion. The total public debt reached $267.02 billion, equivalent to 65.6%. A large portion of Malaysia's public debt originates from the 1MDB investment fund scandal that shocked the financial world. This is an investment fund founded by former Prime Minister Najib Razak in 2009, with the goal of socio-economic. It is under the management authority of the Ministry of Finance, but Najib Razak had the power to approve investment projects and decide leadership. In the 1MDB investment fund mega project, besides former Prime Minister Najib Razak, the other key figure was Joe Low, a billionaire living lavishly, fond of shopping and partying. According to separate investigations by the U.S. Department of Justice, Malaysia's 1MDB fund through bond issuance from 2009 to 2015. However, over $4.5 billion flowed from this fund through shell companies to bribe officials and their associates. Embezzled money was transferred to accounts in Switzerland, Singapore, and the British Virgin Islands, and the money was laundered through the U.S. financial system to purchase assets in the United States. After the case was exposed, Najib Razak was brought to justice, receiving a 12-year prison sentence and a $44.4 million. While Malaysia continues efforts to recover billions of dollars lost from the 1MDB fund, Joe Low is still at large outside the law. In that context, having to both reduce public debt and revive the country's economy during difficult times was one of the biggest challenges when Mahathir Mohamad took office as Prime Minister in 2018. To reduce the huge public debt, the Malaysian government implemented many austerity Right in the first cabinet meeting, Malaysia's new ministers unanimously agreed to cut 10% of their salaries, while the new administration also considered cancelling some projects to reduce government spending, streamlining 17,000 civil servants, cutting spending in government. Malaysia also cancelled some unnecessary projects, including the $23.3 billion Singapore-Kuala Lumpur high-speed. Besides cutting public spending, Mahathir also advocated for other measures, including forming a smaller cabinet, reducing the size of the government, and recovering some documents related to the 1MDB state fund. Thanks to efforts from both the people and the government from 2018 until now, Malaysia's debt ratio remains relatively low compared to According to domestic economic experts, the Malaysian government's debt level remains under control, and they argue that the domestic market can still absorb more government debt, with over 95% of this debt denominated in the local ringgit, so there is very little currency risk. Moreover, most of the debt is owned by domestic institutions and does not mature soon. In addition, Malaysia's current economic growth rate remains very positive, so the public debt issue is still under control. Experts believe that as long as the economy maintains a growth rate of over 5%, Malaysia has the ability to repay it. However, if any fluctuations cause the economy to slow down, it would lead to higher public debt and exceed the Malaysian government's control. This in the long term will lead to certain risks for this Southeast Asian country.
Next is Thailand.
In 2022, the GDP of the land of the Golden Temple was $495.42 billion, while public debt was about $299.73 billion, equivalent. Thailand's economy post-COVID-19 pandemic is like a sick person, with a slow recovery putting the country at risk of entering a recession. Among them, reduced tourism revenue, consumer spending, and export turnover are the factors negatively impacting the country's economy. As an important economic pillar of Thailand, the tourism industry accounts for about 20% of the Golden Temple's growth. However, the smokeless industry is facing difficulties after the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition, Thailand's public debt has surged from 41.1% in 2019. These issues pose relatively large challenges for Mr. Srettha, who aims to achieve 5% annual growth for Thailand. On September 21, 2021, the Thai government decided to raise the country's public debt to GDP ratio from 60% to facilitate borrowing more money to recover. Due to the situation of household income and high unemployment rates caused by COVID-19, financial support measures. Mr. Srettha, the governor of the Bank of Thailand, believes that the government's borrowing is to help the economy grow because if the government can maintain current financial stability, there will be no problem when public debt reaches. Meanwhile, the president of the Thai Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Sanin Onguloko, also believes that raising the debts for the government to secure enough financial resources for economic. By September 2023, when officially taking the Prime Minister's seat, Mr. Srettha quickly announced a series of drastic measures to address the economy's problems, including giving every citizen aged 16 and above in the country 10,000 baht, equivalent to $282 a e-wallet, as promised by his Thai party during the election campaign. This measure aims to stimulate the economy by boosting consumption, but it could also increase Thailand's public debt by 15,000 baht.
In addition, Prime Minister Srettha also mentioned long-term goals such as promoting trade, supporting startups, and investing more in transportation infrastructure. Second place is Indonesia.
This is currently the country with the largest economy in Southeast Asia. According to 2022 data, the GDP of the archipelago country was, while public debt was about $529.32 billion, equivalent to 40. Currently, Jakarta has been and is facing social, economic, and environmental pressures. So Indonesia's capital relocation project to a new location is seen as and also one of the important steps to enhance comprehensive economic and infrastructure development nationwide. The capital relocation plan had been proposed by many Indonesian presidents, but it wasn't until that he officially revived this idea of his predecessors. President Joko Widodo has chosen the name of the new capital, and it will be built in a heavily forested area in East Kalimantan province on board. With a total investment of up to 35, it is expected that the Indonesian government's funds will contribute about 20% of the, with the remainder coming from private investment. In 2022, Indonesia announced a $2 billion spending budget for the Nusantara construction project. The aforementioned budget allocation will be used to build basic such as road networks in the new capital and the headquarters of the. Additionally, this expenditure will also be used to build some links connecting educational infrastructure facilities, healthcare, defense. Besides the Nusantara capital, most of the country's budget will be used for other, such as social welfare, including housing, clean water, connectivity infrastructure like roads, bridges, railways, and responding to the same. In particular, to cope with geopolitical, Indonesia's president also approved a 20% increase in defense spending from 2020. And it is projected that by 2034, Indonesia's defense spending will reach $55 billion. The top position in this list belongs to. This is one of the largest economies in Southeast Asia, with a GDP of $466.79 billion. Currently, Singapore leads the region in having the highest with total public debt in 2022 at about $781.87 billion, equivalent to 167. Overall, Singapore's public debt has steadily increased from 73.5% in 1990 to the current 167.55%. One of the main reasons is the government's large spending to stimulate the economy. Due to the impact of the global financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially the US-China trade war. Additionally, the country also spends huge amounts on developing public housing and increasing social and defense spending, all leading to Singapore's record high public debt. The Lion City also successfully issued green bonds worth $522 for expanding the subway network with a 50-year term and first issued in August 2022. On September 4, 2023, Singapore continued to issue its second. As of the end of the first quarter of 2023, a total of $6.1 billion in green bonds had been allocated to 4 areas: clean transportation, waste management, green buildings, and sustainability. According to Singapore's finance minister, the funds from green bond issuance will be used for projects such as renewable energy, energy efficiency, pollution prevention, and climate change adaptation. At the same time, Singapore is currently one of the countries with the fastest population aging rates in the world, so the country will have to spend more on social welfare policies, pensions, health insurance, and elderly care. Looking back at world economic history, almost no economy is immune to the disease of public debt. And Southeast Asian countries are no exception. Primarily, the debts come from countries wanting to strongly develop infrastructure and improve the quality of. From the above ranking, it can be seen that most of the largest public debts today come from developed countries, as well as countries with large economic scales in the region like Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand. Today, high public debt is likened to a global phenomenon. Although it is known that each country has different debt structures, debt criteria, and debt risks. Among the 3 most indebted countries in the region, only Singapore has a public debt to GDP ratio exceeding 1, with the exact figure being 167.5%. However, the strange thing is that exceeding this threshold does not trouble the Lion City's economy, thanks to a combination of fair tax policies, cautious, transparent spending, low corruption, and especially that the public debt is mainly domestic debt rather than foreign debt. Current data shows that Singapore has the highest public debt in Southeast Asia, which is true but not sufficient. When discussing public debt, there are 2 perspectives. One side believes high public debt is bad, but there is also arguing that only rich countries have high public debt due to large spending needs. And high public debt indicates high national credibility, evidenced by Singapore and the US having credit ratings of AA or above, meaning super safe and very convenient for borrowing. High public debt shows these countries are heavily investing in infrastructure, and if you have a chance to visit Singapore, you will see the country is extremely developed. And the people in the Lion City also enjoy many world-class systems and amenities. That is the case for Singapore. Conversely, for developing countries like Laos, a public debt to GDP ratio of 128.5% is very alarming.
because most of the debt is foreign debt and mainly from China.
Additionally, an important note is that having high debt but generating a lot like Singapore is different from having high debt but producing little like Laos. For developed countries, even if they borrow a lot, they also generate enough to repay the debt. This is called sustainable debt repayment.
But for less developed countries, this may be different.
And they certainly must take many measures to reduce public debt to avoid the risk of default. And this is the current public debt situation of 11 Southeast.
Hello and see you again in the next videos. Subscribe to the Gian Migo channel so you don't miss exciting videos.